I'm Sue McCleary, aka Passion Flower Sue, and I'm excited to be part of the 2023 Mayesh Design Stars series. This year, Mayesh has chosen to explore the topic of sustainable floristry and how we as florists can reduce our environmental impact and contribute to positive change. In my first video of 3, I shared some of my favorite reusable and compostable mechanics, and I made a floral pillar with a fabricated structure. In my second video, I shared 2 ways to make a floating floral arch using a natural vine armature. Today, for my third and final video, I'll share my take on cascade bouquets. Traditionally, cascade bouquets were made by wiring and taping all of the floral components individually and combining them. A great skill to practice, but quite time-consuming and ultimately a bit wasteful. More recently, foam bouquet holders were invented to make this process easier and offer these compositions hydration and stability. But of course, we're trying to reduce our dependence on single-use plastic products. The good news is that artful, airy, dynamic cascade bouquets can be made without wire tape or even foam holders. Today I'll share a very simple handheld armature that I used to create these bouquets. It was one of the very first things that I learned from my first mentor almost 20 years ago. I'll start with a modern minimal cascade, and then I'll show you another more traditional take in shades of blush and white. Let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is make the handheld armature. The great thing about this is you can make it with any kind of flexible, branchy material, anything you can kind of manipulate in your hands. I like to go for curly willow typically. So I got this at my local Mayesh, but you can also root this and grow it yourself really easily. And I chose the kind of thin, flexible laterals to work with for this armature. I have about 15 stems of the curly willow. So I kind of make a little handle, hold it in my hand, and then I bring the tips back into my hand, starting to create these loops. So I kind of cross them this way and that, kind of forming a network. Picture chicken wire, all those little nooks and crannies where you can stick stems. That's what I'm creating with this natural branch armature. So this is, for me, purely functional, meaning it serves a structural purpose, but it's not decorative. So this will disappear inside the body of my bouquet. Once I add the flowers, this little armature will disappear. So I want to make sure it's small enough and shallow enough that once my flowers are added, this really just kind of disappears within the body of the bouquet. So now I have all these little loops where my flowers will be locked in place, and I have my handle secure. So I'll trim this into my compost bag. And I'll secure this little armature with a rubber band. So I just keep these and reuse them. They come on nearly every flower bunch I receive. So I'll grab a few stems and kind of shimmy the rubber band up to the binding point, take it around the handle of the armature a few times, and then grab a few stems on the opposite side and secure it in place. So now I have this little structure that will allow me to weave flowers in and hold them in place. This will be a natural stem cascade bouquet, so it's really important that I establish the shape that I want. We'll talk more about that later, but this guy will really allow me to place flowers in my hand and keep them where I want them. So we'll revisit this in a moment. So next, let's talk briefly about the spiral hand-tied bouquet technique. So this is a foundational technique that's really important, and it's my go-to for all of the bouquets that I make. So I'll show you very quickly what this looks like. With the spiral technique, you're building the bouquet in your hand. I build it in my right hand and add flowers with my left. So this is a simple concept, but it does benefit from practice. I encourage you to take a spiral bouquet class and really absorb this technique. Once you have it down, it'll make your bouquet making much more streamlined, efficient, and pleasant. So let me show you how this works. So you add the stems into your hand, and you're not crossing any of the stems. You're adding them all at the same angle. With every few additions, you can kind of give the bouquet a little twist. The spiral really starts to become apparent once you have, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 stems in your hand. I'll show you in a moment. And then I'll show you what not to do. You see how the stems are starting to spiral, starting to splay out? We're going to let them do that. That's how we get beautiful movement and shape in our bouquet work. The binding point where my fingers are is nice and slim, and I'm allowing the stems to splay. All right, so let's look at the stems. Every stem has its own place in the bouquet. Nothing is crossed or tangled. Everything has its own little safe nook, its own slot in the bouquet. So the opposite of that would be to cross the stems, adding from the opposite direction, and see there I have a weak spot. So if I bind that in my bouquet, that stem will probably get compromised and either bend or snap. So instead I'm adding it in line with the rest of its friends. A way to simplify this thinking is when you're making a bouquet, there's a front and there's a back. So in a spiral bouquet, the stems in the back will be facing all in one direction, and in the front, they'll be facing in the opposite direction. So I know that when I'm adding flowers to my bouquet, that if I want a flower over here, I need to approach from this side of the bouquet so that the stems are in line. And if I want something over here, I need to approach from this side of the bouquet so that the stems are all in line. This is how I achieve an airy, dynamic bouquet with a really dainty binding point that's easy to carry. And this is how I achieve the shape that I want. So let's talk a little bit about form. So for me, a modern take on a cascade bouquet has a certain shape. There are some flowers that kind of come up towards the face and kind of create drama and interest up high. And then of course there's focal points kind of mid-range in the bouquet, and then there's the cascading portion. So the natural stem cascade bouquet, we don't have foam to keep the flowers in place, and we don't have wire to keep the flowers in place. So our stem placements are really important. What we're going to do is we're going to create a really splayed kind of horizontal bouquet. Once we're happy with the shape, we'll cut those stems short, and then the person carrying the bouquet will point those stems towards themselves, and we'll have a cascade bouquet because of the orientation of the stems. So what will happen is the stems up high will create that drama up by the face. We'll tuck some of these side stems in a little bit tighter to create the kind of mid area of the bouquet and the focal points of the bouquet, and we'll extend the stems down here longer to become that cascading portion. So it's really important to add the stems in a spiral fashion so that we can have all of this splay, allowing these flowers to take on these different roles. So the flowers up here will kind of come towards the face, the flowers down here will cascade down. And further, we want to make sure our binding point is really attended to. We don't want to change the orientation of those stems. We don't want to bind so low that the flowers we've taken care to, orient just perfectly become crushed. And this internal armature will provide the structure that will allow us to keep these stems open and splayed and creating that beautiful modern cascade form. So for the first cascade, I want to make something really fun in my favorite palette of yellow and white. And I want to show you a few interesting ways to manipulate flowers and make really artful components, but still sustainably. So just a sec. So I do love the artfulness of wired and taped cascade bouquets, but I love the challenge of still, making these artful pieces with flowers, but using compostable ingredients. So I have a few ideas for you, and these will become components for this cascade bouquet. The first is stringing flowers. I love to do this. Hyacinth pips are the perfect flower to string because of their uniform kind of nesting bell shape. And also they're really kind of waxy and long lasting, so they're a really nice component to add to a bridal bouquet, for instance, because they will last and look beautiful for the length of the event. To make those, I used my lei needle and I used hemp twine. So threading the needle first. And then I tie a thick knot. Trim off the tails. And then I thread my hyacinth right onto the twine. I find that one stem of hyacinth makes a chain about this long, about maybe 12 inches long. I cut these off the bloom yesterday, and I put them in an airtight container and sprayed them with water so they could plump up and be ready to last really well for the length of the event. So it's just like stringing beads. Very simple but impactful idea. Just make sure they nest uniformly. These almost look like jewelry. They're kind of accessories for a bouquet, and something that makes a cascade bouquet especially really dynamic and special, with a lot of movement and swing as the person walks with it. So if you're planning for a bridal bouquet, you could make these on Thursday for Saturday and just keep them sprayed and covered with damp paper towel until they're ready to be added to the bouquet. Okay, and the second way that I like to artfully place flowers in a sustainable way into bouquets is by threading them onto branches. So these curly willow branches are perfect for this because they're nice and slim and flexible. So there is some natural drape and cascade to these because of how bouncy they are, how light and bouncy the branch is, but resilient and strong enough. So to make these, I chose the finest laterals of the curly willow, and I tied a little knot on top and trimmed the tip away. And then I cut the bottom into kind of a sharp point so that I can thread my daffodil trumpets onto the branch. I love daffodils. I especially love these very kind of ordinary, everyday yellow daffodils, but their petals get dry and crepey pretty quickly. The bell inside, though, is beautiful for many days longer than the outer petals. So after I enjoy them for a few days, I just pluck off the outer petal, and then I can make cool things with the ruffly trumpets inside. Okay, now that we have these components ready, let's look at the rest of our ingredients. I have some acacia. This is my very favorite late winter, early spring flower. This one does dry really quickly, no matter what I've tried. It dries in about 24 hours in room temperature. So I'm going to use it in kind of its dry state. It's still beautiful, not as fluffy as it was when it was fresh, but it's still gorgeous. So this will be the first layer of my bouquet. Next, I love working with Cymbidium orchids. The thing I love about them is they are so long lasting and there's so many florets on a stem. So you can use these for a lot of different purposes. I've edited them quite a bit so that they aren't, too big to overpower my bouquet. And all of those blooms that I took off when I was editing, I've saved for the corsages, for the boutonnieres, for the cake flowers. So what I like to do is save those flowers. Let me show you. In a little container, airtight container again. I spray them with water. I cover them with a damp paper towel, and then these are ready for corsage work, crown work, boutonniere work, and cake flower work. So instead of giving the cake designer a little bucket with loose stems, you can have these beautifully hydrated, clean, and trimmed florets ready for them. I just like to deliver it in a little box like this with some toothpicks, and then it's ready for them to design. All right, so after the acacia and the cymbidium, I'll add in a little bit of lilac for a little bit of body in the center of the bouquet, and then we'll finish with sweet pea and our little artful additions last. So first, the acacia. So I take my armature in my hand, and I want to, using this spiral technique, add my materials into kind of this sprawling horizontal shape, and you'll see what I mean. All right, so this will be my high side, and then I'll work to my cascading side on the opposite side. So if my stems are oriented in this way in the front, they'll be orienting in the opposite way in the back so that I can mind my spiral. I've kind of bent this branch so that it cascades down. And what I really want is to make sure that I'm not collapsing my flowers. I want them to stay nice and separated. I want the stems down here to be sprawled. We'll cut them short so they're not in the way. These sides here will become kind of my focal area. So I want to make sure that those are kept kind of slim and tight to the armature. The top of the bouquet and the bottom can really sprawl and elongate, but these sides I want to make sure they're nice and kind of slim and tapered. I'll use these short pieces to attend to the sides. Just kind of open my hand and slide the stems underneath my fingers. So in the back, I just open my thumb and add things underneath my thumb. If I want something in the center of the bouquet, I can do that. I just kind of guide my stem through where I want it, and then open my hand and see where that stem lands and kind of tuck it in place with its partners who are next to it. Just trying to maintain that nice, tidy binding point. And you can see my armature is already starting to disappear. If I keep my hand nice and light, just really holding with my thumb and forefinger, I can move stems up and down until I'm happy with how they're oriented. I can spin them around, and the mirror really helps with that. So with every kind of floral layer that I add, I'll check in the mirror to make sure I have the form that I've intended. So again, I like to have this kind of upsweeping line with flowers up high to bring attention to the wearer's face. And then I like to have this cascading portion. I like to keep the sides tighter, and I like to have some negative space. I don't want to do a traditional teardrop with a round top and a uniform shape throughout and a pointy bottom. I want some kind of dynamic lines, and I want some negative space. So I like the way this is going. I'll trim off these stems from time to time so they're not in my way, and so that I can orient the bouquet against my body and look in the mirror to make sure that I have a form that I'm happy with. All right, so now I have the shape that I kind of want to follow. I'll add my next heaviest or largest stem next, and that is the cymbidium orchid, and I think I'm just going to use 2 stems. I'm going to use one up high, brings the drama up. And then I think I'll use one kind of in the mid focal area. So the armature, it has 2 purposes. It's keeping my stems splayed and open so they don't collapse and get crushed, so I can create the shape that I'm after. But also the loops of the armature can grab on and hold things. So because of these 2 functions, I can add my stems either alongside the armature or through the network of loops in the armature. It's my choice. Next, my lilac. Maybe this guy will catch one of those loops, and I can tuck him down tight. A little trim. Okay, now the sweet pea. And I realized this flower makes everything look good. And it's not always available. But any slim line flower or even a nice slim foliage would work in this regard. What I really like about the sweet pea is that I can direct the eye up with these nice slim moments of white. Even these tender kind of slim stems of the sweet pea can be added to a spiral bouquet because each little stem has its spot. Nothing's getting crossed or crushed. I'm using the kind of dried quality of the acacia to kind of tuck stems into so that I can elongate this cascading portion. It's giving me a little added structure. Okay, now the fun artful components. Let's see where I want to add these. These shorter ones maybe kind of on the side. So again, I can add stems wherever I want in the armature. I just have to make sure that the resulting bottom of the stem is kind of tucked into a safe nook with the rest of its friends, not crossing, not complicating or compromising any of the other materials. That's pretty fun. Let's let these cascade down. Maybe one of the shorter, stronger ones can go up here. And the acacia will help me a little bit, keep him in place. Now we'll add the hyacinth. I'm grabbing a little loop of the armature and kind of guiding my thread in that before putting the thread in my hand. You could certainly tie it into the armature if you want more security. I can lay it in the body of the bouquet and then guide the end of the thread into my hand. The wonderful thing about working in the mirror, you can orient things, you can kind of spin them in your hand before you're committed to their final placement. It really allows you to see what the finished product will look like before you hand it over to its recipient. Up high, we kind of have this dip in with a focal area here. Very important because it's next to the person holding the bouquet. This is the area of interest. So this little side of the bouquet is really important to me. And then of course the cascading portion with a lot of movement and drama. So now to finish the bouquet, we have to bind the binding point just where my fingers are. We don't want to lose the shape we worked hard to get. And then we have to cut the stem short so that the person holding the bouquet can hold it close to them and orient all of the faces of the flowers towards the viewer. All right, so to bind, you could use waterproof tape, you could use bind wire. Today I'm just choosing to reuse the rubber bands from the flower bunches. So again, I take a few stems and I shimmy that rubber band up to where my fingers were, to the binding point. And then I kind of open up my hand and take that rubber band around, trying to really keep it exactly where my fingers were. Take it around a few times and then secure with a few other stems, just grabbing a few other stems. And voila. So I'm able to achieve this airy, really sprawled, dynamic cascade bouquet because of the internal armature that prevents the stems from, getting crushed together and making a uniform mass. It allows me to have a lot of sprawl and air, but also the spiral, that severe angle of the stems, allows things to really keep their position in the bouquet. Pair that with the really small, nice, clean binding point, and all the flowers are protected and ready to go to their event. Before I would hand it off, however, I would wrap with a nice ribbon and finish maybe with a few pearl pins, and then it would be transported in water. So I'd have a nice box, maybe with a decorative paper, and then a vase of water tucked inside, and then the bouquet would just be placed on that paper and it would transport very securely to the event. So here's the cascade with these artful elements. Now I'll show you a more traditional take. So here we have the finished cascade, kind of a crescent shape with a nice scooped out focal point to really accentuate the wearer's gown and bring attention up to the face and also down to the very bottom of the bouquet. I hope you enjoyed this take on cascade bouquet work. I hope it encourages you to practice making these artful bouquets with confidence and a natural approach. Thank you so much to Mayesh for all the wonderful flowers you provide every day and for asking me to share my thoughts on sustainable floristry.